In the deepest part of a flooded cave in Mexico, a teenage girl lay untouched for nearly 13,000 years. She was not buried. No one placed her there. No monument marked the spot. She vanished into darkness, and the earth sealed the evidence. Around her, the dead gathered in silence. Ice Age beasts, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, ancient predators and prey, all trapped inside a chamber that should have been impossible to reach and even harder to survive. When divers finally found her, she was resting more than 60 meters below the modern waterline, inside a vast sinkhole called Hoyo Negro, a black hole beneath the Yucatan, a place so remote and dangerous that reaching it still means swimming through long tunnels of total darkness, guided only by artificial light. At first, the discovery looked like a miracle of preservation, a nearly complete skeleton from the end of the last ice age. A young girl, about 15 or 16 years old, barely 5 feet tall, frozen in geological time. But Naia was more than a rare body in an impossible place. She carried a problem that had haunted American archaeology for generations. Because for decades scientists believed the first people in the Americas did not look like the native peoples who came later. Their skulls seemed too different, too narrow, too ancient, too unfamiliar. Some researchers thought they came from entirely separate migrations, perhaps from different parts of the world. Then Naia appeared, and from the floor of a drowned cave, she began to unravel one of the oldest arguments about who the first Americans really were. Long before Naia was found, the story of the first Americans seemed straightforward on the surface. The standard view held that people crossed from Asia into the Americas near the end of the Ice Age, moving through Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska. From there, they spread south. Over time, they became the ancestors of Native American populations across 2 continents. It sounded clean, logical, almost settled, but the bones kept interfering. Some of the oldest human skeletons ever found in the Americas did not seem to match the people they were supposed to descend into. Their skulls were longer and narrower. Their faces appeared broader. Their jaws looked heavier. Compared with many later Native American groups, they seemed to belong to a different physical type entirely. That difference became a crack in the story. Researchers began to argue that the peopling of the Americas may not have been a single movement at all, but a series of separate arrivals. One population, then another. Different origins. Different routes. In the most speculative versions, even different continents. The first Americans in this view may have left few descendants replaced by later migrations that carried a different appearance and a different ancestry. It was an unsettling idea because it implied that the earliest human history of the Americas had been misunderstood at the most basic level. The problem was that skull shape can suggest a pattern, but it cannot prove a lineage. Bones change across time. Populations adapt, faces shift faster than origins. For years, the argument remained suspended between appearance and ancestry. And then, in the darkness beneath the Yucatan, a nearly intact skeleton emerged from a world older than the debate itself. The discovery itself felt improbable enough to belong to legend. In 2007, a team of Mexican cave divers, led by Alberto Nava, was exploring the submerged passages of the Sacactun system in Quintana Roo, one of the longest underwater cave networks on Earth. They moved through hundreds of meters of stone tunnels in near black water, following lines through spaces once open to air, long before the sea returned and drowned them. Then the passage opened. Beyond the tunnel was a vast vertical chamber, Hoyo Negro. The black hole, a giant pit dropping into darkness, its floor scattered with bones. Not one skeleton, many. There were remains of extinct Ice Age animals everywhere. A gomphothere, a distant relative of elephants, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, bears, creatures that had no business sharing the same grave, except that this place had once been a deadly trap. During the last ice age, when sea levels were far lower, the cave was dry. Its mouth would have been accessible from the surface. Animals entered. Some never found the way back. Others simply fell. So did Naia. Her body was discovered on a ledge and the floor below preserved with astonishing completeness. The injuries suggested a catastrophic fall, including damage to the pelvis consistent with a sudden violent death. She was not ceremonially placed there. She was lost there. That detail mattered, because Naia was not just ancient. She came from exactly the period scientists most needed to understand near the end of the Ice Age around 12,900 to 12,000 years ago, old enough to stand close to the first chapters of American prehistory, intact enough to ask a question earlier skeletons could not answer. What she looked like only sharpened that question. At first glance, Naia seemed to deepen the old contradiction. Her skull had the features researchers had come to associate with so-called Paleo-American remains, longer, narrower, and visibly different from the cranial shapes common among many later Native American populations. If scientists had stopped there, she might have been used as another argument for the idea of separate peoples, separate migrations, separate origins. But this time, the skeleton had preserved something more powerful than shape. Inside one of Naia's wisdom teeth, researchers recovered ancient mitochondrial DNA. That was the turning point. Bone can suggest. DNA can connect. When the genetic results were analyzed, Naia did not point to some lost population unrelated to Native Americans. She carried mitochondrial haplogroup D1, a lineage found only in the Americas, but ultimately derived from Asian ancestors who crossed through Beringia. That single result changed the argument, because Naia combined two things that many researchers had treated as contradictory. Her anatomy looked like the earliest American skeletons that seemed unusual. Her DNA linked her directly to the ancestry of indigenous peoples in the Americas. The divide between early Americans and later Native Americans had not disappeared by debate. It had collapsed inside one body. In 2014, the findings were published in Science by Jim Chatters and colleagues, and the implications were difficult to ignore. The old skulls had not revealed a vanished race. They had revealed an earlier physical form within the same, broader ancestral story. The mystery did not end there. If Naia belonged to the same founding population, then the real question was no longer who these first Americans were. It was why they looked so different in the first place. The answer was less dramatic than replacement, and far more important. Naia suggested that the earliest Americans were not one people followed by another unrelated one. They were part of the same deep founding lineage. The apparent break in the story had come from something more subtle. Bodies can change while ancestry remains continuous. Over thousands of years, populations do not only move. They adapt. Diet changes. Climate changes. Growth patterns shift. Isolation, stress, and environment leave marks on bone. A skull is not a passport. It is a record of development, survival, and time. That distinction reshaped one of the oldest debates in American archaeology. For years, some researchers had treated the unusual appearance of early skeletons as evidence for multiple separate migrations into the Americas. In more speculative versions, the first inhabitants were linked to distant populations with no lasting connection to native peoples. Naia made those claims much harder to sustain. She showed that an early American could look different in the skull and still belong genetically to the same ancestral stream that led to later indigenous populations. And that mattered far beyond a single cave in Mexico. Because once that link was established, the first settlement of the Americas looked less like a patchwork of disconnected arrivals and more like one major human expansion, followed by regional change across immense distances and harsh landscapes. The variation was real, but variation did not require separate origins. Even Naia's own life seemed to fit that harder world. Her bones showed signs of stress. Her teeth carried evidence of nutritional strain and wear. Her pelvis suggests she had given birth despite dying in her mid-teens. She was not an abstraction in a migration model. She was a person shaped by a brutal frontier, which made the final implication even more striking. The first Americans were not strangers to Native history. They were its beginning. So, what makes Naia unforgettable is not only her age or the improbable way she was preserved. It is the setting of the answer. For decades, one of the most persistent questions in American prehistory turned on a visible difference in bone. Scientists looked at ancient skulls and saw distance, separation, maybe even disappearance. Then, at the bottom of a drowned chamber, no one could have entered without modern equipment. A girl who died at the end of the Ice Age quietly refused that conclusion. She had the face of the mystery. She had the DNA of the answer. That is why Hoyo Negro feels larger than a fossil site. It is a locked room in the history of the Americas, sealed first by stone, then by water, then by time. And inside it was a human being who died alone, surrounded by animals from a vanished world, only to return as evidence in an argument that began thousands of years after her death. Naia did not reveal a lost civilization. She revealed something more difficult to see, and in some ways more profound: continuity. Not the kind history announces with monuments or written names, but the deeper kind, carried through bloodlines, through survival, through people who changed in appearance, yet remained connected across immense stretches of time. She fell into a dry cave in a world of Ice Age predators. The sea rose, the chamber flooded, the centuries passed. And when she was found, she did not just tell us how one girl died. She showed that the first Americans were never missing from the story. They had been there all along, waiting in the dark.